This is another iROAR podcast.
That's probably part of it, but I think part of it is the way that we're keeping dogs is really bad for their health. And to unpack that a little bit, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is what I would call behavioral health. And that's, we were touching on this a little while ago, the capacity of a dog to be able to engage in a reasonably full range of natural, so canine specific behavioral patterns. And so much of what we do with pet dogs in terms of training and confinement go against or confine or constrain dogs behaviorally in ways that are harmful.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn. This is Season 7, Episode 9. In this season, we're focused on animals and multi-species health. And you might have noticed throughout the season that we had a bit of a focus on dogs. This was somewhat by design. As you know, the Remaking One Health Indies project has been a sponsor of this season, and a lot of their work is focused on dogs and dog health in India. So while we were learning about multi-species health and concepts that are really quite valuable beyond talking about canines and dogs, we did focus many of the conversations related to dogs and some of the differences between, let's say, pet dogs and street dogs or guardian dogs, etc. But in today's episode, the final interview for the season, barring the grad review, which is coming up next, of course, we decided to focus explicitly on talking about dogs' health. So you might have noticed the arc throughout the season was speaking about multi-species health as a concept, unpacking some of the ideas regarding healthy publics or marginalized multi-species communities, and really just kind of diving into different concepts and examples that help us think through multi-species health. Today, we're looking explicitly at dogs' health, and I'm delighted to be joined on the show with Jessica Pierce, who has written a great deal about dogs and the ways in which they interact, or are at least allowed to interact with the world. So in this episode, Jessica joins me, and we speak about everything from the end-of-life care for dogs to breeding practices to discourses about dogs' purpose in society. It's maybe not necessarily what you immediately think of when you think about dogs' health. Maybe you're thinking about going to the vet, etc. And in some ways, I think it's really nicely tied back to the second episode where we spoke about healthy publics. I really, really enjoyed speaking to Jessica today. It was very generous and very personal, oftentimes, in some of the reflections with regards to dogs. And I think you'll enjoy this episode a great deal. Let me tell you a little bit about Jessica. She's an American bioethicist known for her work in the field of animal ethics and the philosophy of human-animal relationships. She's written a number of books about dogs, such as Who's a Good Dog and How to Be a Better Human, as well as A Dog's World, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without People. That one she did with Mark Beckhoff. And finally, Run, Spot, Run, The Ethics of Keeping Pets. And of course, these are topics that come up throughout the show today, thinking about pet keeping. I think has also been an underlying theme throughout the season. Jessica's passionate advocacy for the well-being of dogs has sparked global conversations and driven positive change in the ways society perceives and treats our canine companions. She's an affiliate faculty at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical School, and you can find out more about her on her website, of course, with all of the links in the show notes. Just a reminder, while it's not part of this season, I did have Alexander Horowitz on the show just for the season. And we also spoke explicitly about dogs, but they're thinking more about how dogs perceive and know the world. And that was also a remarkable conversation. So if you're interested in having, a listen to explicitly focused content related to dogs, definitely go check out that bonus episode too. As always, I want to say thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics, Apple, for sponsoring this podcast, as well as the Remaking One Health Indies project for sponsoring this season. It's really been nice working with people that have such an explicit focus on thinking through health and explicitly the politics of health. It's been dynamic and interesting to engage with. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, go and check out our sister podcast, The Animal Highlight. And speaking of the animal highlights, today Rashmi joins us in that final segment of the show to speak about a dog who took matters into her own hands when her owner was treating her poorly. Of course, Rashmi's been focused on guardian dogs throughout the season, and she speaks about a dog who had had enough and made a big decision to leave, which is very, very interesting. Rashmi and Priya, who have been doing the animal highlights throughout the season, will be joining me in the grad review in the next episode, and we'll think and talk a little bit more about both their highlights as well as the themes throughout the season. So make sure you join us there. And as always, please, please, please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. Okay, it's a fascinating conversation, so let's get to it. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast.
Hi, Claudia. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the show, and I'm very excited to focus today on dogs' health. The whole season has been focused kind of explicitly on dogs' health, but kind of speaking more generally about multi-species health with a bit of a slant towards focusing on dogs. And I know that you've written a great deal about dogs and dog health and the ethics of keeping dogs. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today, kind of just a general conversation about what does it mean when we say dogs' health and what should we be thinking about. And this could be both practical and also, I think, academic. Like, what does health mean? Health seems to be one of these words that we throw around all the time. But you're an interesting person. You call yourself a bioethicist, which is very cool, and a philosopher. So can you tell us a little bit about you and how you came to be interested in bioethics and philosophy with thinking about animals?
Sure. So I studied religion as an undergraduate and went to seminary, and there discovered that what I was really interested in was not so much what people believed per se, but how people behaved. So I started studying ethics, and bioethics is a kind of it's a really interesting field. As you noted, it's kind of a strange field. Like it means a lot of different things, and you can be a lot of different things as a bioethicist. And for me, it's been a way to think about and approach the biological sciences from a critical lens. And, you know, in the early days, my focus was a little bit broader. I was working in a medical school, teaching medical students, and I was very interested in environmental studies. And so the extension of my work in the medical center became the extension of my intellectual interests became sustainability in medicine and healthcare. I was always interested in animals and animal ethics, but at the time, I think my own imagination and also the imagination of my colleagues in bioethics was limited to thinking that if you're going to do animal ethics, it means you're thinking about animals in research settings. And I did go down that path for a while, and I found it so profoundly distressing that it's like, I can't do that. About 15 years ago, I started thinking more explicitly about animals and ethics in, I'd say, a more positive way. And this might sound weird that I would frame this as a positive, but my beloved dog, Odie, was nearing the end of his life. And he was really struggling he had some neurological deficits, which made it was really difficult because he was not, at least under the assurances of various vets, he was not experiencing physical pain. He was really struggling. He had lost control over his back end and his movements, and his bowel movements included. And I'm like, how do I navigate these end of life decisions for this being who's not a human? And so I started to think about, you know, what does hospice mean in the context of animals, and what does it mean to be in charge of the death process for this animal? Because we really have even if we take a passive, I'm not going to do anything, that's still an active set of moral choices. And so I just got really interested in animal hospice and end of life care. And, there's this huge human literature, of course, that's really the meat and potatoes of bioethics is end of life care. And, whether people should be kept alive on artificial respirators when they are in a vegetative state, which have gotten a lot more complex in the last month or so with new research. But I found there wasn't a really robust literature in animal ethics.
It's so interesting that you bring up, your story with Odie and making, and I hope you can tell us what you decided and how you navigated that. But it's really interesting because this whole season we've been focused on animals and health and thinking about dog health. But so often when we talk about health, we have a tendency of focusing on life, like what is health and life. And I think this goes for humans too. Somehow we often suspend death. We all know that death is this one thing that we share. No matter your class, no matter anything, we will die. And often we don't prepare ourselves for death. We don't prepare ourselves for the death of those who are closest to us, including our companions, our more than our pets. And it's such an important part of health.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that became really clear to me is that in end of life scenarios, at least, and I think this definitely broadens out to dogs' whole lifespan, that a holistic approach to health is really important because, people get really fixated on physical symptoms, but, a dog with physical symptoms A, two different dogs might have very different emotional reactions to or ways of responding to this scenario. And so if you're just looking at physical symptoms, you're missing important pieces of the picture. And I think that's why Odie's situation was so hard, because he was clearly engaged in psychological suffering, but that's so nebulous. It's hard enough when it's another human being to understand what somebody is going through, especially because, we say, well, we can understand other people because they talk to us and they tell us, but it's not that simple, because people don't tell us the truth necessarily, or they tell us what they think they want us, that we want to hear, and so forth. So I think it's very complicated. And then you add that layer of species difference, and it gets even more complicated.
And of course, because we tend to, I don't think that anthropomorphic methods are inherently problematic or wrong. I think that, using our own understandings of emotions, and it's how we navigate the world. So I don't think it's inherently problematic. But of course, there are dangers that come with anthropomorphic, and especially now when maybe I could see how someone looking at the end of life of their dog is being inconvenienced and somehow rationalizes that the dog is suffering when maybe they're not. So it's a really difficult. Not to say that someone would necessarily want their dog to die or will their dog to die, but I could imagine it happening. That it's really hard. You've got a lot of shit to clean up. You've got to take them out in the middle of the night to pee. There's just a lot more going on, and maybe there are other stresses in your life. And then you say, well, emotionally they're struggling, so I need to put them down. And yeah, it's not a quantifiable question. It's not a quantifiable answer, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right that quality of life assessments, which are, they're a dime a dozen now online, do a quality of life assessment for your dog or cat. But they really, I think, confuse our quality of life with our animal companions' quality of life in important ways. And your example of having to, an animal who has lost control of their bowels, that's an inconvenience and quality of life problem for an owner, but it might not necessarily be that for the dog, or at least very manageable. And so I think it's really helpful to pick that apart and to say, yeah, the quality of life of caregivers is really important. And that kind of defines or delimits the kind of care that is possible for the animal, and acknowledging the burdens of caregiving emotional, physical, financial, etc., and not making people feel guilty for not being perfect, because nobody's perfect, but sort of acknowledging the limitations and the possibilities, and then saying, okay, what can we do given that, and what does this particular animal need given what we know and what we can tell. And I think it's, you see often in the end of life literature, oh, well, animals can't talk, so they can't tell us what they want, so we have to decide for them. And I think that's really oversimplified. I think they can tell us what they want in large measure if we're willing to do some work to figure out what they're saying. They're talking to us all the time in body language, in behavioral language, and it's just a matter of listening to what they're saying.
So what was Odie telling you?
I think we did end up calling the euthanasia vet finally. And I think, I struggled so much with that decision because I felt like it was, on the one hand, not fair for me to, there's a part of me that feels that it's unethical to take a life. And at the same time, I started to feel like Odie's was having more bad experiences than good. I guess that's the basic calculation. You just are kind of weighing bad versus good. And I realized that I think I was hesitating for myself and not for him.
Sure, it's a hard thing. And I mean, it's always, even in terms of comparing human and animal deaths, I've always found it quite interesting. There are many humans that are alive that do want to die, but we've vilified, and you said you studied religion, so you certainly know, like the vilification of suicide, for example, and I'm not here trying to say that anyone who is thinking these thoughts shouldn't seek help or speak to a counselor. That's not my intention here. It's more a matter of saying, particularly folks who are older and are saying, listen, I'm done and I would like assisted suicide, or folks that are really, really ill and are in a lot of pain. And as you say, experiencing more hurt than good. It's remarkable how we've got this in many contexts, the sanctity of human life. You don't, no matter how much the person is asking to die, you don't kill them. And again, coming back to kind of, I know bioethics is often centered on medical qualms, and I'm sure that this is one that's been picked apart. Whereas with dogs or companion animals, as you said, I'm sure it hasn't been picked apart as much. The speed with which euthanasia is used. So at the very least, you grappled with it, which I think is a significant point.
Exactly. And I think for me, what became evident, and I have been through the end of life process with a second dog, and I have a third who sadly is reaching toward the end. And I feel like I'm better armed with skills and information. And one thing that with Odie that I think I did was kind of black and white. It's like either euthanize or keep him living. And like there's a lot of gray in between that, where, I mean, that's what hospice is essentially just easing that transition and maybe quickening that transition. And by giving more pain medication than you might otherwise. And it's been super interesting. I haven't written about this or talked about it much yet, but I have now experienced with my mother and my father, but in very different ways. Both of them have chosen BSED, which is voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And it's just talking about taking control and actually being at a point where death is something that you want to invite in seems more reasonable to me now. Like I really have some greater insight into why somebody might do that. Anyway, that's off topic.
No, I don't think it's off topic at all. It's I mean, yeah, I think it's just recognizing, like you said, it's not as black and white. And I listened to a Sam Harris podcast ages ago where they were speaking about death and just how it is a generous thing to do for your loved ones, is to also think about your own death, because many of us don't think about our own deaths. And there is something, and for it to not be this, it doesn't have to be this scary, dark. There is something really sad about it, of course, but it can also be can also be a state of your life that you can take some control over and some enjoyment over and reflection over, which I think is quite beautiful. And same thing for our dogs as they get older too. And as we recognize that they, in the span of our lives, their lives begin and end. And I think that that's a massive responsibility when it comes to dog health, is recognizing that they deserve a rich life. And when you plan for their death, and like it makes me emotional thinking about when Linus will die. You know, we bought a bicycle trailer the other day, and I didn't buy a cheap one because I was like, he's gonna get older and I need to get him used to getting into a trailer now so that when he's older, we can be more mobile and make sure that he can still go out on adventures when he's older. He's nowhere near that now, but he has some dysplasia in his elbows, and we know that as the years go on, mobility is going to become more and more difficult for him. So this is a long-term plan, right? It's not just about thinking about that moment of death, but recognizing that there is an aging process as well.
Yes, I think that's wonderful that you're doing that. And I will say, being on the other end of that now, we have our dog Bella has some pretty serious mobility limitations, and she has a stroller and she loves it. It just opens up the world in ways and so that's so good to plan ahead and think ahead. And I remember a hospice veterinarian saying to me, and I was really struck by this. He said, hospice planning, like end of life planning, begins when a dog is a puppy. Like you've got to come to terms with the fact that their lifespan is not indefinite. And if you plan ahead, both for older age and also for the end of life, you can do such a better job with it. And I think it's really hard for people to plan because then you have to look into the abyss.
Yeah. And also plan for your own death. If you were to die, what would happen to your dogs? Because I think many people listening, so Linus comes from a shelter, and shelters are often traumatizing places. He was in there for a good couple of months, and he had a rough start prior to them, but I think shelters also have a lot of trauma baked into them. And the number of older dogs that wind up in shelters, either because people have moved or because people have died and there was no plan and no one was capable to take. This is another thing, is planning for your death, the same we would with any other dependent. What happens if you die? And that's also a hard question, especially if you've got a complicated and difficult dog, right?
Yes, right. Which we happen to have. Yeah, it's very difficult. Luckily, Bella loves our daughter, so we have that out. But yeah, I think going back to the human realm, my father's death was really it was heartbreaking, and it was so beautiful because he chose. He was in good physical. He was 93, really good physical health, but he was progressing into really serious dementia. And he knew he did not want to go any further down that path than he was. And he was sort of like at this tipping point where he wouldn't, in fact, I didn't think that he really could carry out a decision. I didn't think he would remember from breakfast to lunch to dinner to not eat, but he did. And it was one of the richest and most joyful weeks, 10 days. I mean, we read, and my brother was there, and family came or got on Zoom, and he, in large part, I think, wanted to do what he did in order to spare his family pain, the pain of having to put him in a memory care, which I don't think is necessarily, that's so awful, and I don't think it is, but he did not want that. And just to take control. But our animals can't do that. We don't let them. So I think it's even more important to listen to what they're saying in that realm.
When we think about dogs, something that's come up several times in this episode is, depending on who you're talking about, different imaginations click into place about where dogs are. And we've been focusing so far, at least, in thinking about death and the dog owner relationship, right? How do you, as someone who's taken on a dependent and unfortunately in many places property, this is a very distinctive type of relationship between humans and dogs that's not as widely distributed as people imagine, as people in North America and Europe imagine. It's actually rather peculiar in most of the world. So when we think about death, and maybe you know something about this, when we think about death of street dogs, for example, or free roaming dogs, do we know much about the ways in which they choose to die?
Almost nothing. There was one small study that somebody did on mortality rates of free roaming dogs on an Indian reservation in the Four Corners area. And that's really the only research I know of. There probably is more, but what he found was that the primary driver of mortality was humans, like 80%. I don't remember exactly, but it was like without humans, and not only humans like with guns and being hurtful and hateful toward dogs, but also automobiles or poison, whatever. And that was the main issue. I think probably there.
So we don't know much about the culture they would choose or the ways in which they would foster dying.
We don't. No, we don't. And I think it'd be fascinating to study it, especially, as we're discovering with research on other species like elephants and dolphins and orca whales, peccaries, and all sorts of, like the more we look, the more we find in terms of, death-related or grieving-related behaviors. So certainly that would be something very interesting to study.
Yeah, and I imagine very, very difficult because as many of these free-roaming dogs and street dogs are often urban dogs. So yes, the mortality is things like cars, or they're getting captured and euthanized because people think it's in their best interests. But it would just be really interesting, perhaps to look at dogs that are largely left alone, like those in Chernobyl or Fukushima, right? Like how do they navigate death? Do they leave groups? Do they have specific places where they visit? I don't know. I mean, there is so much we don't know about dogs, which is rather remarkable.
It's fascinating how much we don't know. And the more I know, the more I realize I don't know, if that makes sense. Like it's just this vast, I mean, for a species with whom we arguably have like the most intimate, friendly relationship, it's really a blank slate.
Mm-hmm. How much do you think that narrative, or so I have Mariam on the show and she speaks about a species story, and we've got this kind of fixed idea often in our mind about the impenetrable human-dog bond. How much do you think this gets in the way of us being able to see dogs as dogs, or to actually just see their behavior?
A lot. And I think that one of the narratives, and there are probably many, but one of the narratives that seems to really have a grip on us in this country is that dogs have evolved to be our friends, and that we have shaped their behavior and their morphology. Like we're the hand of God, reaching down and manipulating their genes to get just what we want behaviorally and morphologically and so on. And that I always come back to that movie and book, Bruce Cameron's book, A Dog's Purpose, which it's a sweet book. It also gets under my skin because A Dog's Purpose in this scenario is to be a companion to a person. And like that's this dog going through various, like one life after another until he finally comes back as, the dog of the person he was meant to be with, like soulmate. And that dogs have evolved to be pets, which I would say they have not. I mean, they're adapted to it in some ways, but also not. And I think it being so heavily invested in this narrative, we have a hard time seeing the ways in which dogs have not necessarily adapted to being pets, or the ways in which our pet keeping practices harm them.
So it seems if we're going to talk about dogs' health, one of the first moves we need to do is think about which dogs and how these dogs are already sitting in our societies, because the question is vastly different when we're speaking about the health. I mean, certainly there are evolutionary desires that are similar in street dogs and in pet dogs that we should be attuned to. But what street dogs need in order to be healthy and what pet dogs need in order to be healthy, because they exist, because different structures shape their lives, there's going to be different responses. Like, but pet keeping is not going to end tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a really interesting question. And I would answer it in sort of opposing ways. Like, you're suggesting that pet dogs need different things from what free roaming dogs need. And I would argue they need the same things, or it's the same things that are missing from the lives of pet dogs, or, where they're behaviorally, just to take an example, dogs are behaviorally motivated to roam. That's sort of in their genetic code, as it were, this moving over a relatively large area of land freely and marking territory and, engaging in relations with other dogs and other creatures. And even though we keep dogs as pets, they still have that behavioral motivation. They still have the behavioral need to hunt and acquire food on their own. At the same time, your point is spot on, and that we need to look at the individual context that's the individual ecosystem in which a dog is trying to survive and hopefully thrive, to really figure out what that dog needs. And free roaming dogs have different needs in some respects than pet dogs.
Like, it seems, breeding is definitely a big factor that's shaping the health of pet dogs. Certainly many pet dogs can become streets or free roaming dogs, but you kind of see street dogs often end up looking. I've been fortunate enough to travel to many parts of the world, and a remarkable thing happens when you start to pay attention to street dogs is you realize they start to look very samey in many parts of the world. Their color starts to look the same. Their kind of size looks the same, the shape of their ears. And I'm not saying that they're identical. They're not identical in the way you think of about breeds. Sometimes you'll see two dogs of the same breed walking down the street, and it's disturbing how similar they're able to make cut and paste versions of animals. I think it's bothersome. But it's really remarkable when you go to various parts of the world and you see free roaming dogs tend towards a specific body type.
Yeah. Actually, so Mark Beckoff and I wrote a book called A Dog's World, and it was about exactly this. It was a thought experiment. Like, what would happen to dogs if humans disappeared tomorrow? All humans. Like, would dogs survive at all? And if they did, what would their evolutionary trajectory look like? And, it seems to us, based on the current scientific understanding and to theories of evolution, that dogs would evolve toward this kind of what you're describing, this kind of a mean, that medium-sized kind of, it's not going to be brightly colored. It'll be, tawny or, rust-colored, and it's not going to have the extreme features like a squished-in face or an extremely long nose, the features that we, for God knows what reason, find aesthetically appealing at the moment. It's going to be a dog who is functionally adapted to survival, which is not what we're breeding now. We're breeding dogs who will not survive without us.
This speaks about domestication again. Is like it's a political thing. Every time you intervene in terms of how animals look, and like it's not neutral. It's not without harm. And I do think it really is a decision when you choose to buy a specific breed. And it's an uncomfortable thing because once someone has a Labrador or a pug at home, they're amazing, beautiful creatures who deserve to be, they're not to be vilified. They're here, love them, give them good homes. But we should be having conversations about whether breeding should still be allowed, whether it should still be glorified in breeding shows.
Yeah. And that's one of those, I have said that publicly that we shouldn't breed dogs. And people do not take kindly to that perspective. Like, that's a sacred cow. So is the idea that dogs want to be our pets, which is absurd. There are a lot of these sacred cows. Another is all dogs should be reproductively neutralized at the earliest age possible, which has some significant health consequences for dogs. And I could go down a long list of these sort of sacred cows or myths that I think are really embedded in dog keeping culture, but are very bad for dog health. That's probably enough for now.
Yeah, it's really tough. And I think listeners to the show have heard me go on enough about breed enough times to be like, okay, she's not a fan. So you're in safe space. You're in a safe territory here in terms of those views. But I think it's important it's not just an opinion, right? Like, it's important to recognize that breeding it's an industry, and it's not just breeding of dogs, right? We're talking domesticated animals are often bred, but increasingly so are wild animals. Wild animals are kept in captivity, and the logic underlying breeding is to fulfill a desire and a want of ours. And that's the crux of the matter. Like, is it ethical? Is it in the animal's best interest? And maybe often people here would say, well, oh no, the breeding has shown that it helps them in X, Y, and Z.
I think that's a very self-serving, and I hear, that's what you hear. I think it's very hard to make that argument about, for example, French bulldogs. And people will say, oh, well, we're making them better. By what? Making their nose a millimeter less short so that they get, die when they're 6.2 years old rather than 6 years old. And I don't actually think that's the trend. The trend is toward more extreme morphology. And, brachycephaly is just one manifestation of that. And people, I have a hard time with that because I have so many friends. Oh, I got a golden retriever and from this breeder, this very reputable breeder. That's what people will say. It's like, if you're saying that, if you're inserting that qualifier in there, I know you're uncomfortable with it. And the fact that they have to kind of justify. And, there's another sacred cow / myth that I think really needs to be debunked, which is that dogs in shelters have behavioral problems, in greater percentages than dogs from breeders, which is not true statistically, based on what available research there is.
We had a friend actually get a breed for a very specific reason. And it's interesting how the discourse on breed operates, because they got a breed for a very particular reason, because that was the type of dog they wanted. And they didn't want to get a shelter dog because they'd seen how challenging, like we've had many challenges with Linus. He hasn't, but I wouldn't reduce that to his shelter experience. Like, he's had bad experiences, but other people get shelter dogs and things are fine. But anyway, they'd seen our experience and were like, nope, we're not doing that. We're getting a breed. We're getting this breed. But interestingly, he's ended up with a whole host of behavioral problems. And again, it's been reduced to his breed. He has these behavioral problems because of the breed. So there seems to always be an out, instead of maybe zooming out and saying, well, societally, why are so many dogs freaking out at the moment? Why are there, like, you walk down the street and you can just see dogs are struggling. There are a lot of really well-trained dogs, but if you pay attention, dogs are having a bad time.
They are having a bad time. I completely agree. And, that this is really the topic of my latest book, Who's a Good Dog. I am profoundly disturbed by what I'm seeing in the world of dogs. Dogs are having a really hard time. And if you look at the veterinary literature, rates of anxiety, behavioral disorders they're off the charts. Now, is that just because we're more sensitive to it now? So we have the same questions about human experience. Is it just that we're noticing it? that's probably part of it. But I think part of it is the way that we're keeping dogs is really bad for their health. And to unpack that a little bit, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is what I would call behavioral health. And that's, we were touching on this a little while ago, the capacity of a dog to be able to engage in a reasonably full range of natural, so canine specific behavioral patterns. And so much of what we do with pet dogs in terms of training and confinement are go against or confine or constrain dogs behaviorally in ways that are harmful, I think. And, to take a couple examples, one thing that I really am bothered by are bark deterrents. I think they're very harmful to dogs. They're uniformly marketed as compassionate, humane and safe is the language you will see. And I don't think they're either of those things, because they punish a dog for barking. But a dog who's barking is communicating. She is not being bad. She's communicating. And a dog who is obsessively barking is suffering. So the response shouldn't be to punish them. The response should be to figure out what's causing suffering, which is probably boredom, loneliness, frustration, something like that. But you see bark colors on, it seems like everywhere I look, or these ultrasonic bark deterrents that people put on the back of their house, or that neighbors put on the back of their house to control the neighbors' dogs, are, I think, driving dogs crazy. Electric fences, shock collars, crates. I can go down the list.
It's interesting because a sound is a different kind of mechanism. We, like, when Linus barks, we're on the ground floor. So when he barks, he runs straight for and he goes, and he's got a booming bark, right? Like, it's huge. And of course, we're also trying to navigate his bark as well as our social responsibility and social milieu with neighbors, etc. And I mean, this is it's not about pointing fingers and saying you're bad. And I think there are many ways we could all behave better to help dogs. But are our societies geared? I think they're increasingly less geared towards accepting dogs and dogs' barks. I don't know if you saw the movie Stray with Elizabeth Lowe, and it's so sad what's happening in Turkey now.
Oh, no, I didn't. I saw another movie called Stray, which was a comedy.
No, this wasn't a comedy. This was Elizabeth Lowe. She followed a stray dog around the streets of Istanbul. Beautiful. But what was remarkable is you saw these dogs engaging in many of the behaviors you've mentioned here. Roaming, there was fighting, there was a scene where you clearly saw the dog hunt, and it was distasteful, and she showed it. She showed these dogs as kind of confounding some of our understandings of who they are, and also how they had loose relationships with some street children. They did choose to hang out with some people. But what was quite interesting is it seemed to me that many of these street dogs seemed better socialized, better able to encounter and sort out agreements without things getting as nasty as they often do in dog parks, with people, without this fear mongering.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. And what comes into my mind is this whole sort of behavioral category that has been created called leash reactivity, which is sort of like, if you step back and look at it, it's really unnatural for a dog to be on a leash, and they're reactive because, or if you want to even use that language, I'll put that in scare quotes, because it's scary to be constrained in the way you move and communicate with other dogs. But instead of saying to ourselves, oh, it's hard for dogs to be on leashes, how can we think through giving them more freedom? We'd say, oh, leash reactivity is a behavioral problem. We'll have trainers and we'll have leashes that are specially designed to work for reactive dogs, like leashes with, that head collars or whatever it is. So again, we're sort of compounding the suffering by creating this behavioral category problem and then treating it with Band-Aids.
Yeah, and of course, you've got to speak about the industries that are attached here as well, right? The industry, the medicine industry, the more anxiety there is in dogs, the more medications there are to treat that anxiety, the more trainers there are to treat that anxiety, the more devices we have to treat that anxiety, the more there's these industries are massive, massive industries. And the scale of the pet industry, not just in terms of the animals being bought and sold, but all of the appendages is astounding. It's really astounding. And a lot of that, it's in service of profits and capital. It's not in service of your dog's health. Although, I mean, there are really great toys and stuff out there, sure. But it's more a matter of thinking through, yeah, like, I mean, Linus loves puzzles. He's a puzzle dog. He's not big on social things, but we can make puzzles out of toilet rolls. So you put a toilet roll inside another roll, and then you put it inside another, like it's gotten ridiculous. We've got like 6 layers of things now, then getting, because he likes to unpack things. And I've yet to find a puzzle toy in the pet store that kind of serves his needs and interests. It required us to be responsive to him. But of course, there are dogs. I'm not trying to slam on really cool toys, is what I'm saying. But I do think I do need to think.
Totally agree. Yes, there are products out there that are genuinely beneficial to dogs, but there are also many that are not.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's important to just take a moment to think about how we're caught up in different industries and how they're playing on our desires and our fears and our concerns, and how health is a very, very powerful motivator for us to do stuff. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit. It's been really easy talking to you, and I think I've got more questions, but we've covered a number of things now with regards to thinking about dogs' health. So on the one hand, we've said, okay, when we talk about dogs, we need to think across where they are in society to really think about their health. We need to think about practices that happen, such as breed, pet keeping, and how these are part of bigger kind of structures, industries, etc., and that all of these are often working against dogs' health, dogs' physical health, dogs' behavioral health, and dogs' emotional health. And that what's actually required of us is a little bit more nuance and time and sensitivity to the dog in front of us. What does this dog need? What could they possibly be telling us? And how could we be more receptive and sensitive? Keeping in mind our different constraints, and also trying to be brutally honest with ourselves, how we might have these blind spots and be actually feeding into a much bigger picture that's hurting dogs. And we have a responsibility there. On the other hand, we've got street dogs who often tend to be a lot more better socialized. They morphologically tend to go towards one another in similar ways. If there was a world without humans, they would physically probably look like that. And in many ways, because they're able to free roam, they often seem to be a lot more socially secure. But they face a lot of physical challenges because of their urban environments. They tend to get hit by cars. Humans also are one of their biggest predators and hurters. So what these different dogs need in terms of health, they both need to be able to be dogs. And to be dogs requires what does being a dog require?
I would say the freedom to be able to engage in a wide range of species natural behaviors, and the freedom to live one's life as one chooses. And that's a difficult one because the essence of pet keeping is we make that decision for an animal and take away an animal's freedom. And I think people find it really upsetting when I describe dog keeping as a form of captivity. But I think it's a helpful lens to at least entertain some of the time, to realize that we're putting them in an environment that's very challenging for them, and that they're doing their very best to adapt to it, usually, and sort of within the constraints that they have. And I mean, the way I sum it up in Who's a Good Dog is and this is not exactly answering your question of what do dogs need, but sort of pivoting it to what can we as humans who are currently actively caring for and in a caring relationship with a companion dog, what can we do to be better humans? And I came up with what I call the 3 C's. There's sort of like 3 guiding principles for how we can sort of improve our interactions, and they're care, curiosity, and collaboration. And, you know, the care element is pretty obvious. I mean, just actively providing the care that our dogs need to be physically healthy, like the choices we make about their food and exercise and their emotional and social health, you know, what kinds of outlets we provide for them to interact with other dogs safely. And then curiosity, to me, is big. Like we are so saturated by expertise on dogs, veterinarians, trainers, you know, books, videos, you know, people telling us how to do things and what to do and how to think about things. And I think just stepping back from all that and going with beginner's mind, this is sort of Zen idea. You just forget what you know and just try to be with your dog and be curious about your dog. So if your dog barks, you know, one response to that is to get annoyed. Very reasonable response. You know, when Bella barks, I get a surge of adrenaline. Like, it surprises me. And if she barks a lot, I might start to feel irritated because it's a lot of sensory overload. I really have been working on trying to shift my mindset into curiosity. Like, what is she barking at? Why is she barking? What does this bark mean? And, you know, reading about dog barking, there are I'm grabbing a number of it out of a hat, but, you know, 9 different, there's more than this, but 9 different kinds of barks. You know, a bark that's warning, a bark that's saying hello, a bark that's scared, and trying to be curious about the barking instead of being irritated by it. And that, I think, can lead to a spirit of collaboration with our dogs where, you know, it's not that they have to behave. Like, their behavior, typically, we expect our dogs to do 98% of the behavioral modification, and we might do 2%. And it really should be more like 50-50. Like, we need to change the way we behave too. And if, you know, for example, there's a barking issue, we need to perhaps change our own behavior leading up to that and in response to it.
So if the open window is constantly triggering Linus, maybe it's time to close the window. Instead of saying he just needs to adapt, no, maybe I need to adapt to having a closed window. If I know that that's going to be a trigger for him, and then I'm going to end up getting irritated with him barking out the window, then it's not a one-sided need for change.
Yeah, it's a partnership, not a. I think we can get kind of, especially from a kind of a training mindset, that we're shaping their behavior, but they legitimately can and should be able to shape our behavior too. And they are, but we should be open to that.
And then that can lead, you said, to things like collaboration. And I mean, one area where I've seen us use the device we've spoken about was with the leash. I started to get Linus would sometimes stop on the leash. And often I see when people, you know, when dogs stop, people yank and they pull them along. This is the way we're going. But what's quite remarkable is how often he uses the leash to communicate to me that he wants to go a different direction, or he needs a minute to sit and smell what's going on. So his stoppages and his resistance, he's learned to use the resistance on the leash to communicate very particular things to me. And at first I was like, oh, come on, no, we're going this way. And then got curious and was like, okay, well, what happens if I go and stand next to him? And he leads me down a different path, which is quite remarkable. And sometimes that's not possible. So I've had to figure out ways of negotiation, going to him and be like, okay, buddy, I see you. Thank you. we got to go this way now.
Yeah, we're not going across the highway.
And often he concedes, not always. Sometimes it takes more negotiation than, I imagine folks looking at us being like, what on earth is going on? But it is, I really do like those 3 C's. And if I might, I think it could be extrapolated beyond the individual human-dog relationship. I think that if politics, and let's say, we spoke about street dogs really struggling in urban areas. Imagine if urban policy and urban politicians were to apply these at a societal scale, right? To care across species lines, to get curious across species lines. Again, not just in terms of how animals act as ecosystem services or how animals act as some sort of benefit to the city. No, to actually get curious about the other inhabitants of the city space with you, because we've never only had a human space. It's always been more than human. And I think that if we were to foster this kind of political and civic curiosity with street dogs or with other, with cat colonies, with other animals that you find in the city, there could be really remarkable feats of collaboration, better infrastructure so that there isn't so much death and destruction. Better infrastructure, better listening, better lighting, I think you could really scale those 3 C's up. Maybe alternative forms of this companion captive dichotomy.
Yeah, I like that. I think that would be wonderful if we could move in that direction.
A vision for the future. Maybe a future paper you could write about how care, curiosity, and collaboration can change the city.
I like it.
It would be amazing. So, do you have a quote ready for us?
I do. The quote that I picked is one that I have in this Who's a Good Dog book. And it relates directly to the 3 C's that we've just been talking about. So it is appropriate. It's a line from a Mary Oliver poem. It's called Astonishment. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it. And so I take that as instructions for living a life with a dog companion, as just be astonished by how amazing dogs are and how amazing your dog is. Pay attention. And that's the curiosity. And just pay attention to who they are and what they're telling you and tell about it.
That's beautiful. That's really, really lovely. Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful interview. And I think we started from death and ended in astonishment. And that's how I know I'm speaking to someone with a philosophical background. Really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. Before you leave, could you tell us a little bit about what you are working on now? And if people want to learn more about some of what you've done with regards to dogs, where can they go?
So I do have a book coming out on September 10th, which is right around the corner. It's called Dogpedia, and it's part of a series that Princeton University Press does. It's their Pedia series. So they have a Treepedia, Fungipedia, Dinopedia, and this is Dogpedia. So it's a very brief, encyclopedic, A to Z exploration of who dogs are and how humans and dogs have interacted with each other. And so it covers, behavior, biology, history, dogs in war, dogs in racism. It was really fun to write, but I will say it was probably the most difficult of the books that I've written because, as we mentioned earlier in the interview, like the more I learn about dogs, the more I realize it's like this magical kingdom. And I'd open a door and there'd be this whole other room that I didn't know existed. And then I'd open another door and this whole other room. And it just was like this. It was amazing. Dogs are so interesting and surprising.
I feel like that about animal studies in general. And it is, animal studies is, of course, it's born of biology and evolutionary, but there are all of these connections to various disciplines. But I think when people start to integrate ethics and critical thought into their considerations of animals, regardless of the discipline they're in, you just find yourself constantly amazed and constantly also driven because it is important. It's really important work. It's important for the animals involved. It's important for our societies. It's just really great. And I'm happy you found your niche and that you enjoy it. It's really good.
Yeah, it's been fun. And yeah, I don't know what my next project is. I have a couple of ideas. I think that domestication is really interesting and problematic. The narrative of domestication. So I'm tempted by that, but I think it would be very hard to write about. And I've thought about writing a screed against pet keeping.
It's so interesting. My husband actually said to me just the other day, because we're in Vienna, Austria, and Four Paws is a really big NGO here. And they're very, very active and very good at putting up posters, with against factory farming, against fur industry. I've been doing a couple of interviews with regards to dogs and the problematic nature of this kind of pet keeping thing. And he was saying, I can imagine 10 years from now, one of these posters is going to be about, like having bars and like showing, like getting personally, getting in the home. And I mean, this is what feminist kind of thought taught us as well, is the personal is political. What's going on behind your door matters. So it is. There is a mass captivity happening, but it's just been so normalized and so kept in our homes. And it's not all bad. It's not like everyone's a villain, but norms are powerful, right? When something's normal, it's powerful. It looks promising. I'm very excited to either read about your agricultural work or your work on talking about pet keeping, or both. But thank you so much for joining me on the show. I'll make sure that I put your website in the show notes as well if people want to find your work. But thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was an interesting conversation.
Hi, Rashmi. Welcome back to the Animal Highlight. It's your last script with us today.
Yeah, hi Claudia. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's been a really lovely season. I've so enjoyed talking to you and Priya about your field work, and I mean, just imagining the variety of lives that dogs lead and the complexity of it has been a lot of fun. So, who are we going to be, or what are we going to be focusing on today?
So, today I would like to share some of my snippets from the observation that I had while being with the shepherds in this Indian Himalaya and their relations with their dogs. The story revolves around a shepherd and his 15-year-old dog, Rimpy. It wasn't just her; she was also there with her daughter, who was about 5 years old, Kali. And Kali, in turn, was mother to a 1-year-old Khushi. So this was just a grandmother, mother, daughter trio that I'm going to be talking about. So it was quite interesting to see this relationship. And it was just the three of them.
And it's so nice. Like, how often do we actually get to see or hear about these kinds of intergenerational relations with dogs? A grandma, a mum, and a daughter all hanging out. That's really, really lovely.
They're literally blood relatives in their family, and I mean that's the reason that they form like this formidable pack. With each other, and they have this bond that they protect their camp, their livestock, especially at night when they're most needed. Through my informal conversations with this young shepherd about these three dogs of his, I got to wonder about the role of these dogs as active and agentive partners in these shepherd dog relationships. So, when speaking of Rimpy, who's this 15-year-old grandmother dog, I noticed that this shepherd would describe her as one might describe a longtime friend or a relative, recognizing her wisdom and her strong will that he took to acknowledge and perhaps even respect. He recounted an incident that took place many years ago when he and his livestock were camped many miles and many mountains away from his village, migrating towards the summer pastures. And on this occasion, Rimpy, who was much younger then and usually always listened to him, she stole some meat that was drying on the roof of the stone hut where they were camped at. And this unexpected and unusual behavior of stealing really angered the shepherd. And in an attempt to discipline her, he struck her with a stick. Rimpi's reaction was immediate and resolute. She barked at the shepherd in protest and distanced herself from him and the camp, refusing to come near him for the rest of the day. The shepherd did not pay much heed to this at that point, thinking that she would naturally return because this was not the first time that he had disciplined her, and he did not really was very hard on her, in his opinion. And he just waited out for her for the whole evening. But what happened was he called her out for dinner, but she was not available. She did not return to the camp even at night for dinner. And this is when he felt a sense of guilt creeping in, admittedly, and he realized that Rimpi had not returned to the camp for the whole night. His concern grew when he did not see Rimpi the following days, and he realized that she was continuing to avoid him. His worry only stopped when eventually he received a phone call from his parents back in the village saying that Rimpi had made her way back to the village all by herself.
Wait. So he's out in the mountains.
Yeah.
Far. So how far away are we talking here? Like, what kind of distance are we talking about? So she got angry with him and she left.
She left. She left the camp all by herself. And it's many, many miles away because they cross passes that are covered by glaciers, and it's a difficult way, not definitely not by road, but through passes might be the distance might be shorter, but it's nonetheless it's even more difficult because there are mountains, there's ruggedness, there's snow. But yeah, she made it.
And she did this journey over a couple of days, or she did it because it sounds like it wasn't as though his parents called him the next day. They called a couple of days later. So
Yeah, it
she
was a
took.
few days. Yeah. It was
Wow.
a few days later, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There are similar stories that I've heard from other shepherds as well that sometimes the dogs, when they get lost, sometimes the dog just return to the village that they came from when they're unable to find their shepherds in the mountain.
Incredible. Incredible. I mean, that sense of navigation and ability to, I mean, you do hear sometimes these stories, I guess, of dogs in people's homes where people have unexpectedly moved house or something, and dogs finding a way to move across really incredible distances to find them or to find a way back to a home that they lived at previously, which is like, how do they do it?
Yeah.
But yeah, this is really interesting. I'm surprised that the shepherd didn't immediately think that something had happened to Rumpi,
Yeah.
that she had been attacked by, you know, an animal or something. He immediately thought that she might be angry.
Yeah, because she wasn't returning for food because that's I mean they always come at meal times in the morning and the evening, but she
Mhm.
wasn't coming for days, so she assumed that she just went a little away from the camp and was not coming back or finding her food herself, but not returning to him
Well,
out of
good for Rimpy. Good for Rimpy. Well done, Rimpy. Sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going.
no, but it was, in fact, for him also, it was a very profound moment when he realized that when he got a call saying that Rimpi is back at the village, and it seemed that it was at that moment that he truly understood that Rimpi was so deeply upset with his actions that she had decided to abandon him and refused to join him in the migration for that year. And this experience made him realize the depth of her emotional capacity. And he admitted his regret, saying that, she's a wise dog. I should have known better. So the shepherd, reflecting on his treatment of her, acknowledged that the need to make amends in his behavior. He said that from that point onwards, he never raised his voice at her again, understanding that she demanded respect and that her actions spoke volumes about the boundaries that she was setting between herself and him. And through her actions, Rimpi had communicated her disapproval and had successfully renegotiated the dynamic of her relationship with the shepherd. Through this episode, the shepherd not only accepted Rimpi's individual agency, but also learned to respect her as a sentient being with emotional and physical needs, something that fundamentally altered their relationship moving forward. This shepherd was also not just cognizant of Rimpi's distinct and individual personality or needs, but he also recognized the unique traits or character of the other two dogs, Kali and Khushi. He spoke of Kali who's Rimpi's daughter, with particular appreciation, noting that Kali had acquired and displayed many of Rimpi's qualities. And much like her mother, Kali took to guarding the camp, a role she seemed to embrace naturally. The shepherd attributed Kali's aptitude for the job to Rimpi's influence, claiming that Rimpi had played a key role in training Kali to become, quote, good guardian dog. Kali, for her part, appeared willing to follow in Rimpi's footsteps by following her to actively guard the camp throughout the night. However, in contrast, he did note Kushi as well. Kushi seems to stand apart from her mother and her grandmother. The shepherd was quick to point out that Kushi did not show the interest in guarding the camp. She didn't seem to have the same inclination or willingness to take on the role of a protector or a guardian dog. And he wondered and worried that Kushi may not join him in his camp from the following year. It was evident to him that Kushi, unlike Rimpi and Kali, had her own distinct temperament and desires, and he seemed to understand that and accept it. And to me, I found it quite striking that the shepherd was acknowledging Kushi's individuality, recognizing her personal will and choices as central to the relationship that he would build with his dogs in the camp. And this recognition suggested that their bond was not simply based on obedience or function, but also on understanding and having respect for each dog's unique nature. And it seemed that the shepherd was centering Khushi's agency in sustaining their dog shepherd partnership and trying to reflect more on the relational dynamics that were at play at the time in their camp. And the ability of centering individual dogs within the everyday co-living dynamics between shepherds and their dogs underscores a deep relationality that shepherds may be attuned to or engaged with. Through years of experience, some shepherds have developed a keen sensitivity to the unique attitudes and temperaments of the dogs within their camp. And this attentiveness is not just about assigning roles based on instinct or training, but also about acknowledging the dogs as individual beings with their own capacities, their own preferences, limitations. And even under the same external conditions, such as the same environment or practices and routines, not all dogs would fulfill the expected roles of guardian dogs in the same way. And despite receiving similar training and socialization, some dogs naturally excel at defending the livestock, displaying guarding skills or heightened alertness and a protective nature, while other dogs may struggle to take on this responsibility even with the same guidance. They might just simply not be interested in doing these tasks that are assigned to them. And this variation sort of highlights the shepherd's understanding that a dog's suitability for certain tasks goes beyond mere training or is also shaped by the dog's inherent nature, will, and personality. And the shepherds have also experienced dogs, like I mentioned before, straying away from their camps and sometimes for good. And they may search for the dogs for a few days in nearby camps or nearby villages, thinking that the dogs must have lost the shepherd's trail. But when the dogs don't show up for many, many days, the shepherds accept that the dogs did not want to join them during the migration. And in this way, shepherds too exercise and adapt to the responses of their dogs in this partnership. And they may in ways that may not always result in desirable outcomes, but may be able to make an environment that's healthy and sustainable in these dog shepherd relationship and partnerships. But of course, this may not be true for all shepherds.
Something really important for me that you said there is that they might not fit the role that's expected of them. And I think that this is so important. I mean, I think a lot of what we do as humans when we're having conversations about justice and equality is resisting oftentimes ideas about what's expected of us and how it reduces us to something simple, right? Like you're just a girl, you can't throw is a kind of really simple, basic example of what it means when these expectations are applied to you. You resist it because you're an individual and you're not just X, right? So these dogs are not just dogs. They are not just guardians. They are so much more than what they are. And sometimes they might accept and really want to take on what's expected, to be guards. and other times, like you say, they might not. And the same goes for pet dogs or for street dogs, or there are a variety of different roles that dogs can take in society, which I've learned from listening to you and Priya over the course of the season. Yeah, I just think it's really remarkable and interesting to kind of think more expansively about how dogs might choose to spend their time, which is quite remarkable. But now, let's say a dog like Kushi doesn't want to go to the mountains anymore. Would Kushi then just stay at home permanently, or is this would this then result in Kushi kind of being left or let go from the household because Kushi's not doing what's expected?
I think it would be kind of more of the latter. So they don't typically have the concept of keeping dogs as pets or keeping dogs indoors. So if the dog is not joining them in their migratory journey, they'll take them back to the village, and then it's sort of Kushi might just join any free living dog back. Like they're free to roam around, and there are instances of dogs leaving camps and then just being close to, mingling with the market dogs and just staying back with the market dogs. There are some instances of that as well. So they might choose to live, they were living freely, or maybe at least they were ranging freely with the migration and with the livestock, but they might truly start living freely if they no longer can't continue going with the shepherds during migration.
So these shepherds have no, I guess, quote unquote, control over these dogs when they're not doing migrations. Like, I'm just trying to understand, I guess, the broader, because a lot of your highlights have been on kind of the migration time or the grazing time of the shepherd dog's journey, right? But that's only a portion of the year. So what does it look like the rest of the year? So I understand the shepherds, like hearing you now, I'm almost imagining this romantic idea of the shepherds and how like wanting to go out into the mountains to go and do their grazing, and they call across the village, come Rimpy, and Rimpy comes running, and they go off into the mountains to do their grazing. But I literally don't know what to think here. Like, what are the dogs doing when they're not guarding?
So these guardian dogs are with the livestock at all times. So even when
Okay.
the shepherds go back home, they leave the dogs with the flock wherever the flocks are. They may have parked the flock somewhere close to a forest, or away from the roads. So the dogs will remain there. So these
Okay.
dogs do not never enter. So even if they're going back to villages or close to villages, they'll stay with the flocks. They do not enter the household of the shepherd per se. There's always outdoors.
And are the flocks fenced in? Like, so when they're back in the village, are the flocks fenced in?
No, they're never fenced. So the flocks are like they're over hundreds, or they might be 200 in number. So they're not fenced. They're always in the open throughout their life.
And with this particular flock, was it only this grandmother, mother, daughter trio that were with the herd or the flock, or were there multiple other dogs too?
No, it was just the three of them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you once again, Rashmi, for an incredible animal highlight. I've learned so much, and I'm trying to think now about a whole bunch of different things. Thank you. This has been really, really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jessica, for being an incredible guest. Thank you also to Rashmi Singh Rana for a wonderful animal highlight. Thank you to Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, Christian Mentz for his editing work, and Rebecca Shen for her design work. This episode was produced and hosted by myself, Claudia Hertenfelder. And thank you also to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, Apple, for their longtime sponsorship of this podcast, as well as the Remaking One Health Indies project for sponsoring this season. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hertenfelder.
For more great iROAR podcasts, visit iROARpod.com. That's iROARpod.com.